Sons of the American Revolution meeting 3/4/2023.
Let's encourage you. Would you? Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank all of you for coming today and for hearing this program. If we are the sons of the American Revolution and the daughters of the American Revolution, then who was the father of the American Revolution? Well, I would like for you to pretend that you've not seen the title of this program and answer this multiple choice question that I have for you. Who was the father of the American Revolution? A, George Washington. B, Benjamin Franklin. C, Thomas Jefferson. D, John Hancock. E, Paul Revere. And finally, F, Samuel Adams. Well, the correct answer is Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution. Who was Samuel Adams? Well, that's a difficult question because Samuel Adams left no memoirs. He did not ever write his life story. He left no letters that he wrote to any of his friends telling them the details of what he had done in the American Revolution and to bring about the American Revolution. In fact, Samuel Adams even took a pair of scissors and some of his old letters that he had written, and he cut up those letters with a pair of scissors. So he didn't want anyone to know anything about what was going on. He also didn't want to incriminate any of his cohorts and get them into any kind of trouble. First, Samuel Adams, I'll tell you who Samuel Adams is not. He's not involved with this. I am a non-drinker, but a few weeks ago I found myself in a liquor store for the second time in my life, and I got this bottle of beer. It's Samuel Adams Boston Lager, and so there is a connection though with Samuel Adams. Maybe that's not connected to him directly. Also, he went by Samuel Adams, not Sam Adams. Now, one biographer, there's a recent biography that's just come out on Samuel Adams, and one biographer said that Samuel Adams never called himself Sam. Well, that's not quite true. And the reason it's not true is that when Samuel Adams signed the Declaration of Independence, he actually wrote Sam Adams on there, which is surprising, instead of Samuel. Also, a British political opponent of Samuel Adams did refer to him once as Sam Adams, but he was Samuel. Samuel Adams was born in 1722, and he was born in Boston. He was baptized that same day in the Old South Congregational Church. He was the son of Samuel Adams and Mary Fifield Adams. I'm a little intrigued by that name, the maiden name of his mother, because actually that name is in my family tree. My Fifields lived in England. So maybe I'm connected to, distantly connected to Samuel Adams' mother, but I don't know. Samuel Adams' father was also named Samuel. His dad was usually referred to as Deacon Samuel Adams. He was a merchant. This is the dad. He was a merchant, and he owned a malt shop in Boston. Samuel and his wife Mary, this would be Samuel the dad, and the mother of our Samuel Adams, had 12 children, but only young Samuel and his older sister and his younger brother survived past their third birthdays. Young Samuel was afflicted with palsy, and this condition affected him for his entire life. Well, whenever Samuel Adams would become excited, his hand would shake, and at the end of his life, near the end of his life, sometimes he even had trouble holding a pen steady because of that palsy. At age 14, Samuel Adams entered Harvard College, and he majored in theology. He studied at Harvard College, and at age 18, he was graduated from Harvard. Samuel was poor at handling money, but his dad finally took him into partnership in his dad's malt business. The dad died in 1748, so Samuel was 26 when he lost his dad. The next year, at age 27, Samuel married Elizabeth Checkley. They had 6 children, but only their son, also named Samuel, and their daughter, Hannah, survived. Samuel Adams was elected tax collector, but he was very poor at his job. He was quite a poor tax collector, very ineffective. When Samuel was age 35, his wife, Elizabeth Checkley Adams, died during childbirth. Samuel occasionally talked with his second cousin, whose name was John Adams. And yes, that is John Adams, who became our second president of the United States. Also, shortly after that, Samuel Adams, I told you he was not very good in business. The malt business went bankrupt. About this time, the British and the colonies had won the French and Indian War, and that war was very, very beneficial to the colonies because it drove the French away from the frontier right here, and it opened the West for settlement by the colonists. So the British realized that the war was expensive, and they decided to put a tax on the colonists to help pay for the war, the French and Indian War. The British then passed the Sugar Act. Samuel Adams didn't like that, and he began a protest against the Sugar Act. Adams wrote an essay, and that essay was the first public document to publicly question Parliament's right to tax the colonists and also Parliament's authority over America, the colonists. Samuel Adams also was the first to call for the colonists to unite in a protest against England. And this was also, he was the first to threaten a boycott of British goods. Now, he didn't call it a boycott, he called it a non-importation agreement. But this boycott spread among the colonies. And this is significant because Britain had dealt individually with each of the colonies, not as a unified body working together. You'll notice even now that the name of our country is the United States of America. And of course, the word state really means nation. So that's really what our nation means, the title of our nation, the name of it. Adams did not use that word boycott, I said, because the word did not exist at that time. That word boycott didn't come into, wasn't coined until the 1880s, and it was named for a person. His name was Charles Boycott, and he lived in Ireland. Samuel Adams was a widow, and at age 42, he married Elizabeth Wells. A little later, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, and this Stamp Act required a stamp and a tax on everything from documents to newspapers to books to playing cards and even on dice. Ben Franklin didn't like the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act, but he saw a protest as hopeless. That he thought the British would not listen to any kind of a protest from the colonies. But the Stamp Act inspired a firestorm in the colonies, And in response, Samuel Adams orchestrated the call for a Stamp Act Congress to deal with the problem. The next year, Samuel Adams was elected clerk of the Massachusetts House, and Samuel Adams wrote, a man's property is the result of his industry, and if it may be taken from him under any pretense whatsoever, he cannot be said to be free, for he labors like a bond slave, not for himself, but for another. So he was a powerful writer who was able to express his ideas in a very understandable and way that really touched the hearts and minds of the colonists. It wasn't long after that Britain repealed the Stamp Act. Next, Samuel Adams recruited his friend John Adams to become involved in politics. Now, John Adams was 29 at this time, and he was already the richest man in all of Massachusetts. Great Britain came up with another plan to raise funds. It's called the Townshend Acts, and this put duties on glass, paper, and tea. Samuel Adams then began a new boycott in protest of the Townshend Acts. Samuel Adams wrote a circular letter, and this circular letter called for uniting the colonies in resistance to the British taxes. And later, Great Britain canceled all the Townshend Acts except for the tax on tea. In 1970, during a protest in Boston, the Boston Massacre occurred. And in that Boston Massacre, the British soldiers fired on the colonists who were protesting. 3 colonists were killed on the scene. 2 more colonists died from their wounds that they had received in the Boston Massacre. After the Boston Massacre, Samuel Adams won more concessions from the British, and the British agreed to lift their military occupation of Boston. 2 years later, Samuel Adams created the Committee of Correspondence. This was a network of colonial leaders to coordinate as a group the resistance to those British taxes. The next year, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who was loyal to the British control, he wrote secret letters to King George III. And those secret letters called for an end of liberties in Massachusetts and for British troops to be sent to Massachusetts to subdue the colonies. Adams later disclosed those secret letters, those secret Hutchinson letters. This produced a strong response in the colonies, especially in Massachusetts. At that point, Samuel Adams wrote a document called The Rights of Colonists, and this document later was published and became a pamphlet that was circulated throughout the colonies. Samuel Adams also helped to orchestrate the Boston Tea Party, in which chests of tea were thrown overboard from a British ship into Boston Harbor. Samuel Adams then became the first American public figure to call for a Continental Congress and for independence from England and for the writing of a Bill of Rights. In 1774, Samuel Adams was elected a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he won support there for the Suffolk Resolves. These Suffolk Resolves called for the colonists to ignore the British coercive acts, which had claimed that the British had control and the right to control the colonists. Also, the Suffolk Resolves called for the colonists to begin training a militia and to withhold taxes from these royal governments that really were under the control of the British. Samuel Adams was always a very religious person, and he always attended church. Adams then called for 5 ministers to take turns opening sessions of the Continental Congress with a prayer each time. The next year, the British began to see Sam Adams as the colonist they most wanted to capture and arrest and try. Earlier, the British were surprised to find that Samuel Adams actually had failed as a tax collector, and he failed as a maltster. He was nearly penniless, and he was a very poor provider for his own family. One day, Samuel Adams and John Hancock were in Lexington, Massachusetts. At that point, the British troops were planning to march to Lexington in hopes of arresting Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They were in the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark in Lexington. And this was the beginning of the Revolutionary War, because that's the day the battles of Lexington and Concord took place. Later, Samuel Adams was instrumental in the nomination of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The next year, Samuel Adams worked hard to win support for the Declaration of Independence, and he signed the Declaration of Independence. The next year, Samuel Adams became the leading figure in Congress in prosecuting the war effort. His final act in Congress was to sign the Articles of Confederation. You remember that? Really, that document really was our first government that we were under. 2 years later, Samuel Adams attended the Massachusetts State Convention in which the Massachusetts Constitution was written. In 1781, he signed the Articles of Confederation, and also at that same year, he was elected president of the Massachusetts State Senate. In 1788, the Articles of Confederation had established a federal government, but that federal government was too weak to be effective, and something new had to be done. So Samuel Adams attended a ratifying convention for the U.S. Constitution. The next year, he was elected Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. In 1794, Samuel Adams became Governor of Massachusetts. And 3 years later, he retired from public life. And finally, in 1803, Samuel Adams died at age 81. Okay, back to that multiple choice question that we began. If anybody decided George Washington was the father of the American Revolution, we might think of him more as a successful surveyor and farmer. He was a very noble individual, but he was not a main figure in calling for independence. Maybe some of you decided Benjamin Franklin was the father of the American Revolution. Well, in 1754, Benjamin Franklin did propose his Albany Plan. This Albany Plan called for the colonies to unite, but that plan went nowhere, so it failed. Even after the Boston Massacre, Ben Franklin was not warm to the idea of independence for the colonies. How about Thomas Jefferson? Even after the battles of Lexington and Concord had begun the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson said he wanted the colonists to make a new appeal to Great Britain to avoid independence. But Thomas Jefferson changed his mind, and he did become the writer of the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock, well, he was a very wealthy merchant, but John Hancock really wanted to be named Commander-in-Chief of the American forces in the American Revolution. He was disappointed when Samuel Adams threw his support behind George Washington. And this actually led these two friends, Adams and Hancock, to be on not very good terms for a while. Eventually they made up, and they became friends again. Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a silversmith, and he was a great horseman. He's famed for riding from Boston to Lexington to warn Adams and Hamilton that the British are coming. Earlier, Paul Revere had also taken to horseback to carry Adams' writings to 4 different areas. Those writings went to Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. Once, Paul Revere rode for 300 miles, took him 6 days, and he was at that point he was taking the Suffolk Resolves from Boston to Philadelphia. So we might call Paul Revere America's greatest jockey in the Revolutionary War. That's about all I have to say about Samuel Adams, except this. Here's to Samuel Adams, father of the American Revolution.
I didn't know they had Walmart back then. Thanks, Bob. We're going to go ahead and get into our report right now. So we'll start out with our secretary's report.
The minutes from the January meeting and from the November meeting and the January Historic Preservation Committee are in the book up there on the table. We don't like to redo that or double check the minutes or anything like that, but they're in there.
Okay. And then right here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Reminder.
Okay. The ring monitor right here if you want to take a look at it. Okay. Do we have a motion to accept the secretary's report? Move. All right, second.